On the 14th of May, 1871, a 23-year-old widow named Yuen Sao-lin, who could wash for 60 men on 2 buckets of water a day, was handed over at the mud landing below the North Fork diggings to settle her dead husband's $40 debt. The camp's water agent held every ditch, flume, and headgate on the mountain, and the law sided with whoever held the water. Everyone expected her to be worked dry and turned out before the snow. What the company foreman did instead, at the headgate, in front of 40 men, silenced the ditch office for a year. The place called itself Blue Ravine, though there was little blue left in it. The hillside had been opened like a carcass, red and raw, and the great iron monitors threw water at it in ropes thick as a man's thigh, and the sound of that water was constant, a low roar that got into the teeth. Sao-lin stood on the landing with her bundle against her chest and watched a mountain being taken apart by rivers that men had invented. Somewhere under all that noise, a bell rang for shift change. Nobody looked at her except a boy carrying a yoke of pails. They wrote her into the ditch company's ledger as Sally, because the clerk's pen would not bend around her name, and beside it he wrote the number 9. $9 a month, less board, less lodging, less water. She had learned figures at her mother's counter in Sun Wee, weighing dried tangerine peel on a brass balance, and figures arrived in her mind before English words did. So she understood the chalkboard on the ditch office wall before anyone explained it. 1 column of prices for the camp, and a second column, written in the same hand, for the huts along the lower flume. Every number in the second column was twice the first. Water ran past her door all day and cost her double to touch. In her bundle, wrapped in a blue cotton jacket she no longer had reason to wear, lay her mother's copper dipper, worn thin at the lip by 40 years of a well in a village she would not see again. She had not yet asked why she was worth a debt she had never signed, and she had not yet learned that the tall foreman standing at the headgate, saying nothing while the agent counted her out like freight, had been reading that same chalkboard for a month. The wash house at the low end of Ophir Bar was a shed of split shakes and flour sack curtains, and Tam Sao-yin woke in it on her first morning to a sound she mistook, for one blurred moment, for the summer floods at home. It was the monitors starting up on the high bank, 3 iron nozzles the size of cannon, throwing water at the hillside with a force that peeled gravel off bedrock and sent it roaring down into the sluices. The whole canyon shook with it. Red water ran past the door in a graded ditch, thick as kanji, carrying away a mountain 1 bucket at a time, and every drop of it belonged to the Cold Spring Ditch and Mining Company. She sat up on the plank bed and put her feet on the packed clay floor, and did what her mother had taught her to do in an unfamiliar house. She listened first, then looked. 31 Chinese men lived in the row of huts below her along the lower flume, men from Sun Wee and Toi Shan, and one from as far as Hoi Ping, and they were already gone up the grade in the gray light, carrying their own tools, their queues coiled under wide hats. Above them, up a switchback of trampled road, stood the upper camp, the company boarding house, the assay office with its brick chimney, the store with a plank awning, and beside the store the chalkboard. Water by the barrel, water by the week. 1 column for the camp, 1 column for the lower flume, and the second column doubled in the same tidy hand. Her father had spent his life among water gates. In Sha Ping village, where the paddy lay below the level of the river and lived only because men chose when to let the river in, he had walked the polder dikes at every tide with a bamboo pole and a lantern, listening for the small sucking sound that means a dike is drinking. He had taught her to read a wet stain on an earth wall the way a physician reads a face. Her mother had carried water from the village well for 40 years with a copper dipper worn thin at the lip, and that dipper was in Sao-yin's bundle now, wrapped in a blue cotton jacket, in a country where water ran past her door all day and cost her twice what it cost the man on the hill above her. The arithmetic came to her before breakfast, and it did not improve with looking. Chung Tak-shing, who ran the labor gang and the cook shed and the rice account, had a ledger with a canvas cover, and in it her name appeared as a number, $265, being passage from Hong Kong, the broker's fee at San Francisco, the wagon from Marysville, and a marriage contract to a man she had never met, who had gone up to the Comstock in April and left the paper behind him like a coat he had outgrown. Chung had bought the paper. Chung explained the terms while he ate, patiently, without cruelty, the way a man explains weather. She would take the wash house. 10 cents a shirt, 15 for trousers, 2 bits for a suit of long underwear boiled clean of clay. He would take half against the debt and the rice. Boiling took water. Water for the lower flume cost 80 cents a barrel, hauled down in a 200-gallon cart, and the copper boiler in the shed ate half a barrel a load. Saw Yin sat with a nail and scratched the figures into the bottom of an empty bluing crate, the way her father had scratched tide heights into a beam, and the sum said 7 years. 7 years of red clay and lie, if no one fell sick, if the price of water held, if she never once let the fire go out and waste the heat. At the store, the company agent, Mr. Loomis, wrote her into the water book with the point of his pen tapping twice on the blotter first, and what he wrote was, Mary, wash house, lower flume, DBL rate. She said her name. She said it a second time, evenly, the way one repeats a word to a child who is not listening, and he turned the book toward her so she could make a mark, and did not lift his eyes above the level of her sleeve. She took the pen and wrote her name in characters, small and correct, in the margin beside his Mary, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a fly on the page and blotted it dry. She had 11 English words that morning. Water, how much, please, thank you, yes, no, shirt, fire, Sunday, wait. And Mary, which she did not count. The water boy came at 10, a sunburnt child of 9 named Toby who drove a mule cart with a barrel on it and a tin dipper on a chain. He held up 8 fingers. She counted 8 dimes into his hand, one at a time, and he watched her do it, with the discomfort of a boy who has been told a thing is fair and has not yet been able to make it feel that way. Then he pointed up the hill toward the boarding house and held up 4 fingers. He said a word twice. She caught it the second time and turned it over and kept it. That night she wrote it in charcoal on the shake wall above the boiler, in letters copied from the chalkboard, double. It was the first English word she chose to own, and it went up on the wall beside the tally marks of her own debt, which she had begun keeping where Chung would not think to look. At the head gate, a quarter-mile up the ditch where the water came out of the mountain and split 3 ways, the company foreman stood with his hands behind his back and watched the flow the way other men watched fires. He was tall and hatted, and he had said nothing at all the day before while the agent counted her off the wagon and read her contract aloud to 2 witnesses and a dog. His name was Jonas Ward, and in the breast pocket of his coat he carried a leather notebook in which, for the past 31 days, he had been copying down the figures from that chalkboard beside the volumes he actually released through the lower gate, and the 2 sets of numbers had never once agreed. She did not know that. What she knew, at dusk, walking the ditch path with her mother's dipper in her hand, because it was the only thing she owned that had crossed the ocean without being written into anyone's ledger, was that in this country, water had a price, and that hers was twice the number chalked on the board. The board hung on the gatepost of the company's lower flume, where the plank trough came down off the ridge and split 3 ways, and it was repainted every Monday by the water clerk in a careful schoolmaster's hand. Claims, 8 cents the inch. Camp, 20 cents the barrel. Stock, 10. She had learned to read those 3 lines the way a person learns the shape of a stone in the road, by stumbling on it. On her 4th morning at the diggings, she had carried her yoke and 2 buckets to the gate with 2 dimes closed in her fist, and the clerk, whose name was Pryor, and who wore paper cuffs to keep his sleeves clean, in a place where nothing stayed clean, had looked at the coins, then at her, and turned his slate around, and written 40 on it in a hand as neat as the board. Casual rate, he said. You're not on the roll. She knew 4 of those words. She had a thin book of English phrases sewn into her sleeve lining, bought in Hong Kong from a clerk who had never been farther east than the harbor mouth, and none of its pages had prepared her for the word. Roll. She said the sentence she had practiced on the ship until the sound sat flat and clean in her mouth. The board says 20. The board says 20 for households, Pryor said, and he said it slowly and not unkindly, which she came to understand was its own kind of wall. Households and claim holders. You're neither. Your contract. Contract water is billed at the casual rate. That's the company's arrangement. That's not mine. Behind him, a boy of 9 or 10 sat on an upturned crate with the tally slate on his knees, and when she did not move, the boy held up 2 fingers and then 2 more, quietly, as if he were doing her a favor by making the arithmetic visible. She looked at the 4 fingers a long moment, then she opened her hand and paid. The creek could not help her. The creek ran the color of milk tea gone cold, thick with the gray slickens the monitors washed down off the hillside all day, and when she had first tried to draw from it, she had stood a bucketful in her doorway overnight and found in the morning 3 inches of pale mud and a skin of water on top that smelled of iron and cut pine. The spring on the flat, which the men called Cold Sally, had been fenced in April with 4 strands of wire and a gate and a padlock the size of her fist, and a board nailed to the gate with words on it she could not read, though she did not need to. Locks translate themselves. So there was the company, and there was the company's price, and there was her contract, which the agent had read aloud in the wagon yard to 2 witnesses and a dog, and which she had listened to with her hands folded because she had wanted to know exactly what she had been made into. 3 years, cookery and domestic service to the company mess at the upper flat, $8 the month, applied first against passage of $40, outfitting $9, and the brokers $12, with interest at a figure the agent had read very quickly, board and water at her own charge. That last clause was 5 words long, and it was the whole of her life. $8 a month was 27 cents a day. Rice for 40 men wanted water twice, once to wash and once to boil. The mess wanted tea in the morning and tea at noon and something wet at night. Wash water, rinse water, the water she needed to scald the boards after the pork. 3 barrels a day at the honest price would have been 60 cents. At the casual rate, it was $1.20, and there was no arrangement in the world by which 27 cents paid $1.20. She had gone that first week to the men with a basin and a length of soap and taken in shirts at 10 cents and 8 cents for drawers, and she had washed until the skin of her knuckles split and healed white, and the washing needed water too, which she had not reckoned on the first morning, so that every dime the shirts brought in went straight back over the lip of a barrel, and the arithmetic closed around her hands like a wet knot she could not pick loose. So she began to make the water work more than once. She learned the order of it the way she had once learned the order of a household. What must be clean first? What could wait? What could be asked twice of the same bucket? The morning water went to the rice, because rice water must be sweet, and the men would smell clay in it before they tasted it. The water the rice was rinsed in went into a wooden tub under the plank table, cloudy and starch white, and she kept it for the noon wash of the tin plates, where the starch cut the pork grease better than lye. The plate water, gray then and slick, went out into the second tub, and by evening it had settled itself into 2 honest halves, clear above, silt below, and she poured the clear off with her mother's dipper, careful as if she were decanting wine, and used it to scald the boards. The silt she carried out and flung into the hollow behind the mess tent, where the ground had begun to shine with the leavings of her work. 3 barrels became 2. 2 barrels a day at 40 cents was 80 cents. Her wage was 27. The shirts and the drawers, on a good week, made $1.10 across 6 nights of standing over a basin with her sleeves pushed past the elbow, and the basin drank water of its own, and there was soap to be bought, and soap was sold at the casual price too. She did the figures on the back of a rice paper wrapper with a stub of carpenter's pencil, in columns, the way her father had kept the accounts of the herb shop before the accounts had stopped mattering, the debits stacked neat and vertical, the totals underscored twice. Numbers had always been kind to her. They said what they meant, and they did not care where a person was born. She looked at the underscored total for a long while by the light of the cook fire, and then she folded the wrapper into quarters and put it in her sleeve, because a debt looked smaller folded. The next thing she tried was the creek. It ran in the bottom of the gulch, 400 feet down a goat path of loose slate, and it was free, and nobody on the mountain wanted it. She went the first time at 4 in the morning with a shoulder pole and 2 kerosene tins, in the cold blue dark, and she came up in 40 minutes with her thighs shaking and her palms printed with the grain of the wood. The tins held perhaps a third of a barrel between them. What they held was not water in any sense her village would have recognized. It came out the color of milky tea, thick with the fine ground rock the monitors flung down the ravine all day, so that when it stood an hour there was a finger of pale mud in the bottom of the tin, and the rest of it still hung cloudy, unwilling to let go. She knew what to do about that. At home, in the wet season, when the river came up brown and the well went sour, her mother had dropped a knuckle of alum into the jar and stirred once and let it stand, and by morning the water lay clear as glass over a soft gray floor of settled earth. Alum, Bach Fawn, 2 cents worth would have done a week. The store on the flat had a paper card of it in the second case, beside the blue vitriol and the saleratus. "How much?" she said, and she said it carefully, because the word came out better slow. The clerk did not look up from the ledger he was ruling. He named a price that was twice what the card said, in the flat, pleasant voice men used for weather, and when she stood there he named it again, a little louder, as though the trouble were with her ears. She counted the coins in her palm, and she put them away, so she made the water clear without alum. She cut a strainer from 4 thicknesses of her oldest cotton, and she banked a hearth of clean sand and charcoal in the bottom of a lard tin punched with holes, and she taught the mud to leave the water on its own by making it travel, tin to tub, tub to strainer, strainer to sand, sand to kettle, and every stage cost her time, and time was the one currency she had already spent forward. The water came through pale as skimmed milk and tasted of iron and cold clay. She boiled it hard. She threw in a little more tea than the mess allowed, and a scrap of ginger from her own bundle, to give the men's tongues something to argue with besides the mountain. On the 4th day, the mess boss set his cup down half full and said the tea was dirty, and docked her 3 cents for the pork she had scalded with creek water, and told her the men were saying the cook's kettle tasted like the tailings. She went to the company office that afternoon with her folded paper. The office was a plank room with a stove and a wall calendar and a young clerk with a celluloid collar, and he heard her out with his hands laid flat on the counter, and he was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. The ditch sold water by the inch, on account, to claim holders and to companies. The mess got its barrels on the contractor's account at 20 cents, and the contractor's account allowed so many barrels for so many men, and the cooking water was inside that number, and the number had been set in the spring by men who had never boiled rice. Anything past it was loose trade. Loose trade paid cash and paid the casual rate. She unfolded the wrapper and turned it around on the counter so the columns faced him, and she put her finger on the underscored total. 2 barrel, she said. 20 cent, like the men, I pay. Every day I pay. He looked at the columns a good while. He had the grace to look impressed. That's a fine hand, he said. The book don't take names like yours on account, missus. Nothing personal in it. Nothing personal in it. She heard that phrase 4 times that week, from 4 mouths, always in the same easy tone, and she began to understand that it was the local way of saying a door was locked. That night she went up the mountain instead of down. The company flume ran along the ravine on trestle legs, and where it reached the pressure box there was a waste gate that stood open after the monitors shut down, spilling the night head of the ditch into a tail race that ran away to nothing at all. Water going to waste. Free as rain, and 40 feet from her fire. She waited until the last lantern in the bunkhouse went dark, and she carried her tins up the plank walk with her heart going like a bird in a sack, and she filled them from the spill, and hauled them back, and set them under the table to settle, because she was tired enough by then to be careless with what she trusted. It was the settling that told her. In the lamplight, in the silt at the bottom of both tins, among the flour of ground slate, there lay a scatter of small bright beads, heavy, running together when she tipped the tin, silver as a broken mirror. She had ground medicine beside her father for 6 years. She knew a poison when it refused to mix. She carried both tins outside and poured them into the hollow, 40 minutes of climbing gone into the dark ground, and when she straightened up with the empty tins swinging from the pole and her breath smoking, she saw a lantern standing still on the plank walk of the flume, high up against the black, and a man behind it, not moving, watching her pour the company's water away. The lantern did not hurry. It came down the plank walk of the flume in the way a man walks who has walked that walk in the dark for years, one hand on the rail, the light swinging out over 90 feet of nothing, and she stood in the frozen hollow with the empty tins hanging from the pole and understood, in the plain arithmetic of the camp, what she had just done. 40 gallons, company water, poured out on company ground where anyone could see the stain of it spreading black in the dust. In the store's ledger, a woman like her was a line of ink that could be crossed out. She did not run. Running was a confession, and besides, her legs were done for the night. She set the pole down, took her mother's dipper out of her belt sash, and held it against her chest the way another woman might hold a rosary. He came off the ladder at the bottom and crossed to her, and the lantern found her first, the wet hem, the split knuckles, the 2 tins upended in the mud, and then it found her face, and stayed there a moment longer than any light in that camp had stayed on her since April. You poured it out. His voice was low and unsurprised, and the words came slowly, spaced, as though he had decided in advance to say them one at a time. That's 40 cents of water. 80, she said. The lantern tipped. Say that again. For me, 80. She lifted 2 fingers, then 1. For them, 1 bit. For me, 2. He was quiet. He was a tall man, gone thin at the shoulders, canvas coat white with ditch lime to the knee, a gate wrench through his belt where another man would carry a pistol, and his beard held frost in it from the walk. She had seen him before without knowing him, the figure on the high flume at dawn, the one the watermen straightened up for. She did not try to explain in words she did not own. She knelt, turned the nearest tin over, and set it in the lantern's circle, and with the dipper she scraped the last of the wet silt in the seam of the bottom into a small gray ridge. Then she waited, because a thing shown is stronger than a thing said. He crouched. He looked for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he took the lantern down off its ring and held it low, so close the tin's rim went to gold, and among the flower of ground slate the beads woke, small, heavy, bright, sliding together into one trembling bud of silver when he tipped the metal with his thumb. She heard the breath go out of him. "Quicksilver," he said. "Shui yin." She said it as her father had said it, hunched over the drying trays with his sleeves pinned back. Water silver. A poison that walks, he had told her. It will not mix and it will not stay put, and it goes into the bones of the men who cook it, and their hands shake for the rest of their lives, and their teeth stand loose in their heads, and no one can say when it began. 6 years she had ground medicine at that table. She knew a poison by the way it refused the water it was in. "Where'd you buy it?" His voice had changed. Not louder, flatter, the way ice goes flat before it cracks. "The barrel," she said. "The road. Below the boxes." He said it to himself. He put a knuckle in the silt and rubbed it and watched the beads run into the whorl of his thumb, and something moved through his jaw. "He's dipping the tail race. He's selling you slickens out of my own tail race at 2 bits a tin and calling it water." She did not know all of the words. She knew tail race. She had washed shirts in her sleep and dreamed the sluice boxes, and she knew that above them the ditch water came down off the mountain 13 miles clean enough to drink, and that below them it came out gray as pounded ash, carrying whatever the riffles had not held. She had bought 40 gallons of what the gold had already used. 12 weeks, she said. She was ashamed of how her voice went. "Every day. I drink, I wash, I cook rice." He stood up so fast the lantern threw the whole hollow into swinging shadow, and for one breath she thought the anger was for her. It went somewhere behind him instead, up the black wall of the canyon toward the road, and stayed there a moment and came back leashed. "What's your name?" he asked. Nobody had asked. The store's book had her as Ah Sue, in a H hand that was not hers, written by a clerk who had not once looked up from the page. He had asked her nothing that day. He had asked the labor contractor's man, and the man had said something short, and the clerk had written 4 letters and a number, and turned the book around for a mark. "Chan Sao Yin," she said. He tried it. He put the sounds in the wrong places, the way men here always did, flattening the second half until it sat down like a tired animal. "Sa Yin," she said again, and this time she said it slowly, the way her mother had said it across a courtyard, the tone rising where it should rise. "Sa Yin. Better. Not right, but reaching. I'm Ballard. Emmett Ballard. I run the works." She knew who he was. Everyone at Humbug knew the foreman of the Blue Gravel Company by his hat, and by the way the giant's roar stopped when he raised his arm. She had not known his name had a first part to it. "How much," he said, "did you pay for water?" She set down the empty pail. From inside her jacket she took the small book she kept, the one stitched with waxed thread, and turned it to the lantern. 12 weeks of columns in her own characters, and beside them, in numerals she had copied off the store's shelf tickets until she was sure of them, the figures. 50 cents a barrel, twice 50 on the days the laundry came heavy. She had written the date each time, and the weather, because her father had taught her that an account without a date is a story, and a story can be argued with. Ballard could not read a single word on the page. He could read every number. "The board at the tap says 2 bits, he said. 2 bits, she agreed. "For the men. For me, 4 bits. Mr. Rooker say, Chinese water. Different price." He was quiet long enough for the flume above them to say what it always said. That steady, heavy hush of 13 miles of mountain going somewhere else. Then he took the book, careful with it, and held it near the glass, and moved his thumb down her columns, adding. She watched him add. He was slow and honest about it, and he did it twice. $31.50, he said, over the rate, plus what you drank tonight, which wasn't water, it was slickens. $31.50, she repeated. She had that number already. She had carried it up and down the ditch path for weeks, the way she carried the pails, one on each side, balancing. He handed the book back. He picked up the lantern. "Come on." She did not move. 12 weeks in this camp had taught her the difference between being invited and being taken somewhere, and she had promised herself in the hold of the steamer, in the dark with the water knocking, that she would never again go where she had not agreed to go. "Where?" she said. "To the gate," he said. "You can watch me do it. Then nobody can say I did something else." They went up the hill behind the assay shed, up the tailings road where the gravel had been washed so many times it had gone the pale gray of old bone, and then onto the ditch path that followed the mountain's shoulder without ever seeming to climb it. Salme walked 3 steps behind him because 3 steps let her see his hands. 12 weeks had taught her that too. A man's hands told her what his mouth would not, whether they hung loose or curled, whether they hovered near a belt or a pocket. Trask's hung loose. They were split across the knuckles, blackened at the nails from powder and iron, and one of them held nothing at all, which she had learned to count as a kind of promise. The ditch ran beside them, empty. She had never seen it up close. Only the dry line of it from below, a scar drawn along the hillside like the seam of a sleeve. Here it was a trough of packed clay and plank, 4 feet across, patched with sluice lumber gone silver in the sun, and at the bend above the flats it fed into a wooden flume on trestles that stepped down toward the diggings on legs as thin as a heron's. Pine needles lay in the bottom of it. A dead lizard, curled. She thought of the irrigation channels behind her father's shop in Toyshan, the stone gates the village opened by turns, the old men who kept the order of turns in their heads and never wrote it down because the writing of it would have insulted them. "Head gate," Trask said, and pointed with his chin. The gate stood where the mountain creek came down through alder into a rock cut, a plank bulkhead, an iron wheel on a threaded rod, a paddleboard sunk in its slot and sealed with silt and moss. Above it the creek pooled black and cold, and went on past through the overflow with the loose gossiping sound water makes when nobody needs it. Below the gate, nothing. Men were on the flats already, and men see everything on a hillside. She counted 5 faces turned up at them, then 8, then 11, the whole crew of the Fair Play Company's lower cut standing in their gravel with their hats pushed back. "Company shut this gate in June," Trask said. He crouched and worked his fingers into the silt around the paddleboard. Water went to the monitors up at the Blue Cut instead. Nobody down here needed a ditch, they said, because nobody down here is company. "I do not understand all," she said carefully. She had learned to say that instead of nodding. Nodding had cost her $4 her second week. "You will." He stood, spat into his palms, and took the wheel. The rod screamed. It had rusted in its threads, and he had to turn it a half inch, back it off, turn it again, and each turn came with a sound like a nail dragged over slate. His shoulders went up under his shirt. She saw the wet dark spread between his shoulder blades. She did not offer to help, and then she did, and he moved over on the crank without a word, and they turned it together, her hands under his on the cold iron, and the paddleboard lifted an inch and the mountain came through. The sound arrived before the water. A hollow knock, then a rush, then the long exhale of the ditch filling. It came brown at first with rot and needles, a filthy tongue licking down the clay, and then it cleared and ran green-gray and cold, and the flume above the flats began to talk on its trestles, and one of the men below took off his hat and held it, which she did not understand and did not need to. She stood at the edge of the ditch and put her hand in it. Snow, 3 weeks old, off a ridge she had never climbed. Her fingers went numb to the second knuckle. "Your tubs are 200 yards off that flume," Trask said. "I'll cut you a box and a spout. Water don't cost the company anything. It falls out of the sky whether we sell it or not." Salme took her hand out of the water and dried it on her apron, and then she did the thing she had decided on while they climbed, because she had learned in 12 weeks what a gift becomes when the giver has a bad month. "No gift," she said. "I pay." He looked at her the way men look at an animal that has done arithmetic. "You just watched me open it. You open. Good. I pay same as other tent." She reached into her sleeve and brought out the little account book, the one she kept in brush and ink, columns running top to bottom, every bucket she had bought since the 4th of July written in her own hand with the price beside it. She held it open at the page where the numbers changed. Mr. Pike sell water, 50 cent 1 barrel, every tent, the cook tent, the barber, the Frawley boy's mother. Me, he write $1, 12 weeks. Sunday, no delivery, but he write delivery. She turned the book so the columns faced him even though she knew he could not read a character of it. $22.40. Too much. I do not ask you to give me water. I ask you to write me in the book. Same price, my name. The creek went on past the overflow. Somewhere below, a shovel struck rock and stopped. Say it again, Trask said. The last part. My name, she said. Write my name. He looked down at the flats, at the 11 men and the flume beginning to run, and then he took the stub of pencil from behind his ear and asked her for the spelling, and she gave it to him twice, slowly, and he got it wrong, and she took the pencil out of his fingers and wrote it herself along the margin of the ditch tender's tally board where it hung on the gate post. Lao Sao Mei. 50 cents the barrel, 2 barrels the day, which is when she saw the paper nailed under it, weathered, curling at the corner, 4 lines in a printing so official it looked engraved. She could read company, she could read water, she could read account, and she could read the date, which was Thursday, and Thursday was the day after tomorrow. The long word in the middle of the second line she had never met in any lesson, and she stood on that hillside with her name still wet beside it, sounding it out under her breath. Mr. Trask, she said, what is forfeiture? He did not answer for a while. He put his thumb under the curled corner of the paper and flattened it against the gatepost, and he read it twice, the way a man reads a thing he already knows and hopes he has misremembered, and the muscle at the hinge of his jaw moved once. It means they take a thing back, he said, and the taking is the law. There's no arguing after. Take what? Water. He tapped the second line. There's an account run against the lower bar. Your bar. Says it's in arrears, and if it isn't paid whole at the office Thursday noon, the branch ditch is forfeit. Headgate spiked. They send the whole head down the main flume to the monitors at Poverty Hill. The wind came up the cañon then, dry as a chimney, smelling of scorched pine, and it lifted the paper's corner again and let it fall. Below them the ditch ran thin along its bench, a hand's width lower than in August, showing the mud line like a tide gone out, and the flume timbers had begun to shrink and whistle the way they did when the year turned toward frost. She had been sleeping to the sound of that water for 5 months. She had learned it the way she once learned the sound of her mother grinding at 4 in the morning, the low, uncomplaining scrape of a thing that would always be there. How much, she said. He looked at the fourth line a long moment before he gave it to her. $286.40. She stood with the tally board's chalk still under her nail, her own name drying on the wood beside the price she had been made to pay, 50 cents the barrel, 2 barrels the day, written in her hand, so that the difference between her rate and every other rate on that board would be there in the company's own record, where no one could say later that it had never happened. And she did the sum without moving her lips, because she had done sums since she was 7 years old in a shop that sold dried tangerine peel and licorice root by the tail. $286.40 at 10 cents a shirt. 2,864 shirts. There were not 2,800 shirts in the camp. There were not that many men. The account is not mine, she said. No, Trask said. It's the store's. Bought at the company rate on the company's book. Sold on at double and never settled. They let it run all season. He folded the notice's corner down flat again, carefully, as if smoothing it could make it smaller. And now the arrears stand against the bar, and the bar is Chinese, and so on Thursday the arrears get to be your fault. Thursday came in cold and bright, the kind of morning where the frost held in the shadow of every stump until 9. The company office sat behind the assay window on the plank walk, one room with a stove and a rail, and the superintendent had come up from Sacramento on the Wednesday stage, a neat man named Keel with clean cuffs and a soft voice, who said good morning to her pleasantly and then did not look at her again for an hour. She had brought her book. She had kept it since the first week, brush-written, every date, every barrel, every coin, the way her father kept the shop's ledger with the running balance at the foot of each page, and she had brought it in a cloth to a room where nobody could read a line of it. She was not sworn, she was not asked. The clerk explained, kindly, twice, that an unsworn party's memoranda could not be entered, and that the schedule of rates was a matter for the company and its agents, and that the store's account was a separate proceeding entirely, and each of those sentences was true. And together they meant that the room had a wall in it built out of paper, and she stood in it with the cloth-wrapped book held against her chest, the way a woman holds a child's shoulder, and listened to 3 men be reasonable for the rest of the hour. The schedule of rates was affirmed. The clerk gave her a printed copy of it, folded, warm from his hand, and she took it because paper was paper, and she had learned that week to keep every scrap that had ink on it. Outside, the wind came up the street carrying the smell of hot pine pitch and mule, and nobody looked at her, and she stood on the plank walk and thought about her father, who had never raised his voice at a customer in 30 years and had never once lost an argument about money either, because he did not argue. He wrote. He would set the brush down, turn the ledger so the man could see the column even if he could not read the characters, and let the running balance say the thing that a voice would only spoil. That room upstairs did not hear. It read. She had brought it a voice and a book in the wrong hand, and it had done exactly what it was built to do. Trask was at the bottom of the stairs with his hat off, which he did not usually bother with, and he did not say he was sorry, which she was grateful for later. 3 days gone, he said, 10 from posting. It has to be on the recorder's book at the county seat by Thursday, or the notice is waste paper and the lines open to anybody who wants it. You go, she said. They know my name at that counter. He turned his hat once in his hands. Superintendent gets a wire from the valley the same afternoon, and the water's stopped before it ever runs. Your name is on the notice above mine. It has to be your hand at the desk. She thought about the wall in the room upstairs, and about the door she had just found in it, which was a counter, and which did not care whose voice came over it, so long as the fee came with it. He offered the $1.50 in silver. She took it, and that night she wrote it into her book with the brush, on the line under the barrels, in the column where debts went, the sum, the date, the name and 2 characters she chose for the sound of it, and a note that it was to be repaid out of shirts. 11 shirts and 9 pair of drawers, she reckoned, which was 2 nights over the tub and a 3rd night for the cuffs. And when the ink had dried, she blew on the page out of habit, the way her father had blown on invoices in the shop at Sam Shui when the wet season made everything slow to set. The book swallowed his kindness and gave it back to her in the only shape she could carry it, which was work. Before light, she was at the water cart with her yoke and her 2 buckets, and the flat wooden lid she used to keep the slop from swinging out. The frost had put a white fur on the manzanita and on the ropes of the drying line, and the camp above her was already roaring. The monitors at the Blue Point cut never slept, and the sound of them came down the gulch like weather, a long tearing hiss that shook the ground under the soles of her shoes. Pike had his board propped against the tank, the chalk figures redone fresh each morning so nobody could argue with yesterday. 25 the barrel, he said, without turning. Yesterday it is 20, she said. She had practiced the sentence walking down, because sentences went better if she had walked them first. Yesterday was yesterday. He shifted his quid and looked at her yoke, at the buckets, at the wash-reddened hands holding the yoke. And for the wash trade, it's 50. You use it up, miners drink theirs, and it's gone into a man. That's one thing. You boil it and beat cloth in it and pour it on the ground. That's using the creek twice. There was no argument inside that. It was built the way a sluice box is built, to carry one thing in one direction. She counted out the coin for 3 barrels and he chalked it, and she saw that on his board the camp's rate stood in one column and hers stood in another with no heading over it at all. 6 barrels was a day's wash, 12 shirts, the sheets from the boarding tent, the flannels that came in stiff as bark. At 50 cents she was paying $3 for the privilege of earning 4, and the arithmetic of that sat in her chest all morning like a swallowed stone. So at noon she went down to the creek below the tailings with her jar, because a person should look at a thing before deciding it is impossible. The water there came out from under the sluice dumps the color of weak tea with milk in it, and when she filled the jar and held it against the sky, the clay hung suspended and turned slowly, refusing to fall. She set the jar on a rock and squat beside it with her arms across her knees, and waited a full quarter hour. The clay did not settle. It was the fine red slickens the monitors chewed out of the hillside, ground finer than any mill could grind it, and she knew what it would do in a tub. It would go into the weave of a white shirt and stay there, and every collar in this camp would come back the color of the hill, and no beating and no boiling and no lye would draw it out again. A laundress who ruined linen once was finished. She had seen a woman finish that way in Sacramento in 3 days. Her mother would have clarified it. Her mother had clarified the yellow river water of the delta every summer of her life with the white stone, bak fan, a lump the size of a plum crushed to powder and stirred through a great jar until the mud gathered itself into soft clouds and sank and left the water above it clear enough to see the bottom pattern of the crock. Alum. She knew the English word for it because assayers used it and dyers used it, and it sat in tins in every general store from the wharf upward. Ostrander had it. She saw the tin on the shelf behind him, the paper label peeling at one corner. £2 of the alum, please, she said, and put her silver on the counter where he could see it was silver and not scrip. He looked at the coins a while, as though they had been offered in a language he was choosing not to learn. Alum's company stock, he said. Comes up on the company teams. Goes out on company account. I will pay. Account, he said, not cash. Company men, company account. You haven't got one. He moved the tin an inch further back with 2 fingers, which was the only part of the whole conversation that was honest. She stood outside in the road with her hands empty and let the shame pass through her the way you let a wave pass, standing still until it went by. The Tregear boy found her there. He was 9 and he hauled buckets for the cook tent, and he had learned 3 weeks ago that she would trade a warm cake of steamed bread for a lesson in the names of things, and since then he had told her more about the workings of this camp than any grown person had. You want clean water? You want ditch water, he said. Comes off Bear Meadow, comes down 11 mile of ditch in the flume across Deadman's, and it's cold and it's clean as a bell. That's what the company sells to the claims. They sell it by the inch. There's a gate up top with a chain on it, and the foreman's got the key on his belt with his knife. 11 miles of ditch, water measured in inches, sold in inches, poured out of a wooden box with a hole in it, and every inch written in a book somewhere by a man who would never come to this gulch or smell the tubs. She went up the ditch path in the afternoon with her book under her arm. Conroy was at the head gate with 2 men and a shovel and a paper on a board, and his sleeves were wet to the elbow and his hat was pushed back, and the water went past them all in a silence that startled her after the monitors, that flat green sliding hush of a ditch running full. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked like a man who had been half expecting to be asked for something and had already decided how he would answer. She did not ask. She opened her book and showed him the page where she had written his $1.50 as a debt against 11 shirts, and then she asked, in her careful, walked-out English, whether the company sold water to persons or only to claims. And while he was working out how to say no, she looked past his hand at the tally on his board, at the columns of inches given down to the Ophir and the Union and the Blue Point cut, and she saw, the way she had always seen it across her father's desk, that the numbers did not close. 11 inches were leaving the gate every day that nobody was paying for. She turned the board gently with one finger so he could see it right side up, and pointed. He did not look where she pointed. He looked at her hand first, the knuckles split from lye, the nails worn short, a burn scar across the base of the thumb from a boiler lid. And then he looked at the board, and he read the columns the way a man reads a letter he already knows is bad news. 20 inches to the Ophir, 14 to the Union, 9 to the Blue Point cut, 6 for the head race and the wheel. The gate ran 51 inches at the notch, and he had the notch measured himself, in April, with the superintendent standing behind him. Cully, he said without raising his voice. Who else takes off the flume? The ditch tender came up from the shade of the gatehouse with his hat in his hand, and his answer already smoothed over, the way a stone in a creek gets smoothed. The store's water cart, twice a day. It had always been that way. Mr. Pell was a shareholder in the ditch, near enough, and it was only barrels, and barrels did not amount to anything a man would put on a board. Solin stood very still while the arithmetic walked itself into the room. 2 loads a day, 8 barrels a load, out at the flat behind the Joss house at 50 cents the barrel to the wash tents and the cook tents, and the men in the ravine who had no ditch of their own, twice what the company charged the claims for the same water, taken free from the company's own flume, sold back to the people the company had told her it could not sell to at all. In her mother's village at Sam Kong, the paddy ditch had run on turns, measured with a notched bamboo laid across the sluice, and a man who took another household's turn paid the temple a fine and stood while it was read out loud. She had learned to read numbers in that language before she ever learned to read them in English. 11 inches, she said, every day, since April. Trask took his pencil out and did it again himself, on the corner of the board, because he was a man who trusted his own hand. Then he stood looking at the figure for longer than the figure needed. At 7 that evening, at the change of shift, with the day gang coming down off the bank and the night gang going up, the foreman of the Canyon Ditch Company knocked the pin out of the small sluice gate at the head of the flat and opened it a hand's width into a plank trough he had spent the afternoon nailing together out of snowshed scrap. The water came down brown for a moment and then clear, and it fell into a half hogshead he had set on a stand of cribbing timber, and it kept falling, and the sound of it brought people out of the tents the way a bell brings them. He nailed a board to the post beside it, and wrote on the board with a carpenter's pencil, "Water, 5 cents the barrel, sold to any person, tally kept at the gate." Then he held the pencil out to her, sideways, the way a man hands over a tool he expects to get back. She wrote her name under his lettering, in the Roman hand she had practiced on the flyleaf of her book, Ing Salin, and beside it, small, in the ink she carried in her father's chipped slate inkstone, the character for water. It took 2 strokes and a hook. Every man on that flat knew what it meant within a minute, which was more than could be said for most of the paper in the camp. Pell came at 8 with the sheriff and a document. The sheriff read it in the lantern light, and it turned out to be about her store account, which the document called in arrears and threatened with forfeiture of goods on hand, and she stood with her hands folded and let him finish, because she had learned in that office with the paper wall that a man reading aloud will eventually run out of page. When he did, Trask said that the store account was a separate proceeding entirely, and that his own business tonight was 11 miners' inches a day taken off a company flume without a ticket since the 15th of April, which came to a figure he had already written into the report going down to Sacramento on Friday, and that Cully's arrangement and Mr. Pell's cart would both be in it by name. The sheriff had no paper for water. He folded the one he had. The store closed her account the next morning and would not sell her soap, so she bought her lye and her starch off the Marysville freighter at the crossroads for 2 cents less, and by the end of the month 4 other women were buying off that wagon with her, and Pell's shelf of yellow soap sat and went soft in the heat. In October, the superintendent came up on the stage, spent 2 hours at the gatehouse with her book open in front of him, and asked her, through Trask and then directly, whether she would keep the ditch tally at $18 the month. She asked for 20 and got 19. She made the clerk write her name twice in the company register until the second one was right. She paid the 11 shirts off anyway. She had said she would. The winter came in early and walled degradations. The winter came in early and it came all at once. Snow on the high ridge in the second week of October, then a warm rain over it, then a freeze that shut the mountain like a hand closing. By the 4th night the ditch ran black and thick as boiled millet, and skin ice crept out from both banks toward the middle, and the flume boards at Dutchman's Gap wept and hardened and wept again. Wong Yuet Sim walked the line with a lantern and her book wrapped in oiled cloth, and inside the cloth, the way it had traveled from Sam Yup to Sacramento to here, her father's inkstone with the chipped corner. She took the depth at the head gate at 6 and again at 10. She wrote the numbers in 2 columns, one for the company and one for herself, because in her village the men who kept the dike book kept 2, and the second one was the honest one. On the 5th night she read the ice and went to find Hollis. The superintendent, Mr. Farrand, had already given his order from the warmth of the gatehouse. Shut the head gate, drain what would drain, let the ditch go dry until March. 60 men idle. 9 miles of flume left holding a skin of water that would swell and split every joint of it by Christmas, and no water for the monitors in the spring, and no spring wages either. "If you close it," she said, and she said it in English, to Farrand, without Trask standing between them, "the water sleeps. Sleeping water breaks your wood. There's ice in it now, because it walks too slow." She set her palm flat in the air and pushed, faster in the narrow place. Then it does not sleep. Farrand looked at Hollis the way a man looks for a door. Hollis was leaning in the frame with his hat in his hand, snow melting in the brim, and he said only, "She keeps the tally. She's been reading that water since August. They worked it her way, and it was her way entire. She had them open the waste gate below the bend so the whole ditch drew faster through the narrows, then set poles at every bend to keep breaking the skin before it could knit. She sent Purse Ivy and the packers up with fir boughs and had them bank the north side and then shovel snow onto the boughs, snow to hold the cold out, which no one in the camp believed until they laid a bare hand on the boards beneath it. She had ash from the cookhouse spread on the flume walk where the men would otherwise go down. At the gap she made them stuff the joints with straw rope soaked in tallow, the way the Delta men packed a leaking weir, and she stood there until it was done, calling "Fi-dee, Fi-dee, faster, faster," until the word went along the line in white mouths that had never held Cantonese before, and the ones who had refused in June to sell her a bucket of water for 2 bits were passing her buckets now, hand to hand, and calling "Sowie" when a joint went dry. Nobody slept for 3 nights. On the 4th, the ditch was still running. In January, she brought her second column to the gatehouse and laid it beside the company's. Water sold at the Blue Point claim on 11 separate days did not appear in the company book at all. Water sold to the Chinese cruise on Wingfat's ground appeared at twice the rate written in the tariff nailed to the wall. She had the dates, the depths, the initials of the man who took the money. She did not raise her voice, and she did not name him, because the arithmetic named him. Bidwell was gone by February, on the downstage, without the sheriff needing to be interested. The tariff board was taken down and painted over, and hung again with one rate on it. Farron wrote ditchkeeper beside her name in the register, and under it, $22 the month, and this time the clerk spelled it right on the first attempt. That spring the merchants sold to her. Not warmly, some of them, a nod, a scoop, a coin counted twice. She paid exact, and she took her rice and she thanked them in their language and went out. She and Hollis put their money together in April and ran a 2-inch pipe off the waste ditch below the gap, and by June there was a wash house with 3 copper tubs and hot water at all hours, and a shelf of jars behind the counter, dried ginger, angelica, chuan xiong, the bitter bark for lungs that came out of the mountains here as well as there. Miners came for the tubs and stayed for the tea. She hired the widow Ivy, and she taught Perce his characters at the table on Sundays, water and mountain and gold, and he taught her the names of the birds. They married in September, in the gatehouse, because that was where he had first asked her name and waited for the whole of it. She wrote it herself in the book, with her father's inkstone and a little water from the ditch, and the strokes came out black and even and unhurried. Long after, the men still said it on cold nights, hitting the skin ice with their poles, not knowing whose mouth it came from first. Don't let the water sleep.